Hi, welcome to the Storyworth podcast. We're glad you're here. I'm your host, Krista Baum, co-founder of Storyworth. On this podcast, we feature true stories written by Storyworth writers. If you're new to Storyworth, we help people write their life stories, the big stories and the small ones. Once a week, we send our writers a question to help inspire their writing. They reply to the email with an answer or story that comes to mind. At the end of the year, we print what they've written into a beautiful keepsake book. Every story written using Storyworth is private. But for this podcast, the writers volunteered to share their stories publicly with you. At Storyworth, we love celebrating Mother's Day. So many listeners submit thoughtful and beautiful tributes about their moms and motherhood, which makes it really hard to choose a story to feature. But today's story really stood out. In one generation, life was completely different for this mother and daughter. Geography, culture, religion, it all changes. Despite leading very different lives, this daughter still draws inspiration from her mother's life, a world away. Today, Frances Chow shares what it was like for her mother to marry into a polygamous family in mainland China, then raise her children in Hong Kong after the communist takeover of China. This is a truly fascinating story, and I found her captivating.
My mother, Kit Jane Chow, was born in Chouguan, China in 1922. In Chinese, her name Kit means clean and Jane means chaste. Together, the words mean pure and chaste. My mother was the fourth child of her family. She had 3 older brothers, 2 younger brothers, and 1 younger sister. I don't know much about her childhood. I just know that with the outbreak of the Second World War, my mother did not finish her teaching training at Chouguan Teachers Training College. So instead of teaching, she stayed in her hometown and assisted her father in the family business. My maternal grandfather had 3 stores, selling dry seafood and high-end herbal medicines. My mother was one of the store's accountants. She was not only skillful in doing calculation with an abacus, but she also wrote with beautiful Chinese calligraphy. My parents were married in 1946 in Guangzhou, China. The matchmaker was a close relative whose husband was a judge. A reliable and reputable matchmaker was thought to be one of the key elements that would guarantee a happy marriage. The reason my father chose my mother as his wife was because he believed my mother could handle the complicated relationships that existed in his own and extended polygamous family. My father knew that his wife would become the eldest daughter-in-law of a wealthy family with 2 mothers-in-law who were at odds with one another. It wasn't an enviable role to play. His wife had to be a woman of good character who would respect and get along with various family members. My father also realized his wife had to be educated and be presentable on formal occasions, and at the same time, be skillful in cooking and doing various housework. My mother proved that she not only met but exceeded all the criteria. My parents dated 3 or 4 times before their wedding. They had a traditional Chinese wedding. During the ceremony, my mother wore a traditional red coat and long red skirt with embroidered silver and gold dragons and phoenixes. She had a phoenix coronet on her head and a red veil covering her face. To show their respect to the elderly, the couple kowtowed to all the elders in the extended family. My parents, like many Chinese at that time, fled to Hong Kong just before the communist takeover of China. They left many things in China, including the wedding pictures. The ancestral houses would be occupied by communists for almost 40 years. Shortly after they settled in Hong Kong, my parents and my lawful grandmother formed a separate household. Life was a little bit easier for my mother because she did not have to relate all the time to so many members of the extended family. At that time, it was the custom that the husband's younger siblings regarded the eldest sister-in-law as the mother. I remember my mother telling me that when she first got married, my father's youngest half-brother was only 2 years old, and she helped take care of him. She also taught my father's younger half-siblings reading and writing. Even after my parents had formed the separate household, my mother would go back to my grandfather's house to kowtow to the elders. She would perform a tea ceremony on the first day of the Chinese New Year, at my grandparents' birthday, weddings of the younger half-siblings, and other important occasions. Those were not casual visits. She would cook hard-boiled eggs in sweet broth with dry lotus seed and meat from a fruit called dragon eyes. My mother carried the eggs to grandfather's house. Upon arrival, my mother changed to her formal black coat and red skirt, embroidered with dragons and phoenixes. Then she performed the tea ceremony and kowtowed. We children kowtowed too. My mother had other responsibilities as well. She was often asked to write all the birthday and wedding invitations because she wrote with beautiful Chinese calligraphy. Those occasions were held in banquet halls with hundreds of guests. She also sent Chinese pastries and fruits to the elders of the extended family at various festivals. I think the most important and unspoken expectation was for my mother to be a model to all of the younger females of the Kwok extended family. My mother had a premature delivery because she had to kowtow and congratulate all the elders at a close relative's wedding, even though she was at the last stage of pregnancy. The baby would have been my eldest brother, but he died at birth. My parents grieved very much about this incident. In Chinese culture, having a male baby has always been regarded as an extremely important responsibility as well as an honor for a Chinese woman. This was especially true because my father was the eldest and only son of the lawful wife. To my grandparents' dismay, my parents had 3 daughters in less than 4 years. I was the oldest daughter. My mother knew she had to continue to give birth until she could produce a male child. My parents had 3 girls, then finally 3 boys. These children were all born in Hong Kong. Giving birth to 7 children and taking care of 6 living children must have taken a toll on my mother's health. Her hair began to thin out, and her vision began to deteriorate as early as in her 40s. Although my grandmother and the maid helped to take care of us and the housework, there were no modern conveniences in those days in Hong Kong. Water had to be boiled, the stove had to be fanned, meat and vegetables had to pick up daily from the market. I have already mentioned in another story that my father was my first teacher, but my mother was our teacher too. She made sure her children were well versed in classical Chinese literature. She also encouraged us to read our school magazine again and again because other students' exemplary essays were published there. She always wanted us to be good writers. I was fortunate that my parents poured so much love and attention on me. Even though my mother had lost vision in both eyes in her later years, she still asked my father to read classical Chinese literature to her. Chinese classical literature remained her lifelong love. My mother was the one who got affected most when my 5th brother, Qiu Yi, started to have grand mal seizures when he was only a year and a half old. He had a seizure every 4 hours. When this happened, my mother put a metal spoon inside his mouth to keep him from biting his tongue. After that, our home was always in a state of emergency. Later, we also found out he had a severe intellectual disability. My parents spent all the savings on him, taking him to see various doctors. They bought the most expensive and exotic herbal medicine for him. For example, a snake's gallbladder and horse's kidney stones. Chow did not walk until 4 years of age. For a while, my parents believed that brain surgery would cure Chow's intellectual disability. I remember how disappointed my parents were when a brain surgeon told my parents that no surgery could cure Chow. Even at my tender age, I knew it was like a thunderbolt striking my parents. The greatest difficulty was taking care of Chow's daily needs. When I left Hong Kong in 1973, he was 15 years old. He didn't recognize us. He couldn't speak or take care of his own toileting needs. All he could do was feed himself. My mother never gave up hope on Chow. She went to different social agencies and begged people to give Chow an intelligence test. She wanted to enroll him in a school. Unfortunately, Chow had never been administered an intelligence test, nor had he been enrolled in any school. That was one of the reasons why I went back to school to get a professional school psychology degree in my 40s. For me, it was not just a job to earn a decent salary, but a means to fulfill my parents' wish. I have a sincere desire to help families with disabled children. My mother went home to be with the Lord on January 28, 2006, in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. When I first became a minister's wife, I was still in my late 20s. Very often, I did not know how to relate to different age or language groups, or how to serve. During those times, I always looked back and thought about what my mother did for our extended family. I strive to be like her. I'm so thankful that God has given me a mother who is a model eldest daughter-in-law of a big family.
Well, hi, Frances. Welcome to the pod.
Hi, Krista. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, of course. I am actually thrilled to talk to you because this is a story that takes us places. Well, first, before we get carried away with that, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
Okay. I was born in Hong Kong in the early 1950s. I left Hong Kong for college in Canada. After obtaining my master's degrees in Toronto, Canada, I moved to the United States. And I've been staying in the United States for almost 50 years.
Okay.
6 years ago, upon my husband's retirement, my son and my daughter-in-law invited us to live in Salt Lake City, Utah, to take care of the children after school.
Mm-hmm. Are you enjoying that?
Yes.
Oh.
We have 3 married children and 4 grandchildren, and they were all born in the United States.
How did you get started with Storyworth?
In 2020, my children gave my husband and I a very unique Christmas gift. They gave us a subscription of Storyworth, and that's how we started writing. And this is the most meaningful gift that we have received. And in turn, it also becomes the most meaningful and precious gift that we can give to our children and grandchildren. Since they were all born in the United States, we not only recorded our family stories, but we put much emphasis on explaining our cultural heritage.
One, I'm so happy to hear that this was a meaningful process for you and for your kids and for your grandkids. I'm also really glad that you're putting so much emphasis on the cultural context of your lives and, in this case, your mother's life.
Yes.
I love that your story explains motherhood in a culture that is much different than the cultures we've explored here on this podcast so far.
Right.
Now, your mother became a bride in mainland China and a mother in Hong Kong. And did she also immigrate to Canada?
Yes, in her late 50s. She immigrated to Canada and she lived in Alberta.
And her husband came from an affluent Chinese family and a household that practiced polygamy. Was that common?
Yes, at that time. Many men had several wives, and my grandfather had two wives. My father was the only son of the eldest lawful wife, so he has 7 half siblings.
Your dad knew that his wife's life would be complicated, that she'd have a lot of responsibilities and have to navigate family politics. Did your mom go into this marriage knowing that with her eyes wide open, or was the complexity a surprise to her?
I don't think it was a surprise to her because her own family was the same. So she also had 2 mothers. I don't know whether her mother was the legal wife because I've never met them. Those were communist China time. We were not able to visit China. But she had 2 mothers. And she also came from a wealthy family. So she knew, I guess she got into the marriage with a clear idea what she would be expected to do and how she would act.
Yeah, I would imagine. Now, your parents had 3 or 4 dates before their wedding. Did your mom ever tell you what those dates were like?
Not very much. Not very much. I don't know what they did. Okay. They just met 3 or 4 times. So they were lucky that they could get a chance to see each other a few times before the wedding.
What did she loved Chinese literature. Is there anything that just small things that you knew would delight her or make her happy, or a little insight into who she was beyond her duty?
She loves to learn new things. Take, for example, she would make us potato salads. She would use a tabletop oven to bake cupcakes for us, which was very rare in Hong Kong. She would make sandwiches for us using sardines, and she would use mayonnaise. Those were very unusual ingredients of food in Hong Kong at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
So she would look into those things. I guess it's because she had a college education, although she did not finish because of the Second World War. Her mind was really open and was really ready to absorb new things. And once she has mastered those skills, she felt very happy. Like making cupcakes, she felt very proud of herself.
Of course. Yeah. I like that she valued that sense of accomplishment. So why don't you explain, just as a refresher, what was happening in China that caused your family to flee to Hong Kong?
In the later part of 1940s, the Communist Party became in power and won the Civil War. So a lot of people, they fled to Hong Kong. At that time, Hong Kong was already a British colony. For thousands of years, Hong Kong used to belong to China, but China lost the Opium War. But then in 1949, people really know that the communists would get into power. So especially the rich people, they all left China or go to Taiwan or go to Hong Kong.
Yeah. Now in Hong Kong, your parents established a new home with your
legal grandmother.
Father's biological mother. Yeah.
Right.
What happened to the rest of the family?
Hong Kong is a very small place. So my grandfather with my father's half-siblings who were not married, they stay in one place, in one house. But then later on, my uncles, those were my father's half-siblings, they got married, they established their own households. So we lived in different places, but we were all very close to one another.
Now, reading about your mom's role within the Chinese family, honestly, it sounds exhausting. She had a lot to do. Did she find just the satisfaction in this duty, fulfilling all of these roles, or did she find it a little exhausting, like it sounded to me?
I'm sure at times she felt very exhausting because, like I said, she had she gave birth to 7 children and had 6 living children, right? And then my grandmother also lived with her. And of course, we have a maid, but she also had to manage the maid. It's not just, you can do anything, right?
Right.
But my mother was one of the very fortunate ones because in 1950s, most of the families in Hong Kong were very poor. So my grandfather had a lot of businesses in Hong Kong. So we were able to live very comfortably and live in very good neighborhoods. We lived in Happy Valley, which is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Hong Kong. So she was very lucky. She did not have to go through famine or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. But I think there's also this adage she was the role model and that she was expected to kind of be an example. Do you think that she felt kind of honored by that position, or was it harder?
For me, I think she played the role very well. It's hard to be a role model, but you are also respected in many ways. People look up to you. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure she felt honored, but it's also a great responsibility, like taking care of my father's younger half-siblings. The youngest half-sibling was only 2 years old when my mother was married. So she had to help to take care of him. And also she helped the younger half-siblings on reading and writing. So she had a lot of responsibilities. But my other aunts also did the tea ceremony and also kowtow. So she was not the only one. But I guess people expected more from her. Mm-hmm.
Well, she sounds like a really interesting lady. Just to recap here, she was taking care of 6 surviving children.
Right.
While managing the household.
Right.
And the responsibilities of the extended family. And then you added homeschooling and a special needs child. And she's a saint. Yeah.
There was no homeschooling for my 5th brother, who had intellectual disability and a seizure disorder. When I left Hong Kong, he was 15 years old. He could not recognize our face. He could not talk. He could not take care of his toileting needs. So my mother really, really wanted him to be enrolled in a school. But of course, back in the 1960s, I don't think Hong Kong was so advanced that they had special education. Here in the United States, special education started in the early 1970s. It was very sad because my brother stayed at home for more than 20 years. And my mother had to take care of him until he became so big physically. My mother could not handle him anymore. So that was very tough. And we were fortunate that finally an organization accepted him, and he lived in that organization until his death at the age of 34.
You mentioned that was a really hard time for your parents.
Right.
Can you walk us through, do you have a memory of your parents when they were kind of going through every possible cure or procedure?
Right. My parents spent all the savings on him. Like I said, my grandfather was quite rich. So we came from a well-off family. But my parents spent the savings on him, taking him to see various doctors. They spent money on buying exotic herbal medicines like horses' kidney stones and gallbladder and so on. And they thought those things were able to take care of him. But finally, they realized, we must look to the Western doctors. So they took him to a so-called brain surgeon, and they thought the surgeon would operate on him, and then his intellectual disability would be cured. But the brain surgeon told them very clearly, no surgery would help to correct my brother's situation. And also Chinese, a lot of the older folks believe that when you have done something wrong, God would punish you. So they gave you this kind of children. But my parents knew that they have not done anything wrong. And yet they have to bear the shame and the burden of people talking behind them, saying that, you must have done something wrong. So it was very tough on my parents.
I can imagine. You have not only all this concern for your child and their future, but then also managing the gossip would just be an added insult, really sorry. How do you use your training now to help kids like your brother?
In my early 40s, I decided to go back to school to get a degree in school psychology. School psychologists in the United States, they do a lot of assessment. They work mostly with special education students, and the most severe ones would be in special school. So if my brother were living in the United States at this time, then he would be placed in special schools. And there's really not too much academics going on. They would just teach them to feed themselves, to go to the toilet, and so on. We need to help them to have all the resources, not just special education teachers, but we also had occupational therapists, physical therapists, school psychologists, counselors, and a lot of aides supporting the students.
Yeah, getting the whole team together.
So I was in the public school system for 20 years.
Well, so you moved to Canada and you went to school. How did you meet your husband and become a minister's wife?
I went to Montreal. I attended McGill University initially. And then I went to York University to get my master's degree. At that time, I became a Christian and I wanted to serve in the Christian ministry. But I had no money to go to the seminary. My parents were not Christians at that time, so they didn't want to support me. And there was no way I could support myself as a foreign student. But Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts accepted me and gave me tuition scholarships. So I went there by faith, and I met my husband there, and we got married in the seminary. So from then on, I stayed in the United States, while the rest of my family have been in Canada all this time.
Oh, so they went kind of separately then.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like in one generation, everything was totally different. Right? How you became a wife and a mother is worlds away from your mother's experience. But you mentioned how you still drew on your mom's life as an inspiration for your role as a minister's wife and relating to people that were very different than you.
Because Chinese church is like an extended family. Chinese church usually has several congregations because we have different dialects, right? So we usually have a Mandarin congregation, we have a Cantonese speaking congregation. And we also, not so much a congregation, but we always have Taiwanese, which is another dialect. And then we have American-born Chinese. So it's very difficult to be a minister's wife. You really have to be willing to serve, love, and respect different groups of people.
Well, I think that's I love that you're taking lessons from a woman who lived a very different time. It's kind of mind-boggling how different your life is than your mother's. And yet she still has such a powerful influence over who you are and how you navigate your life. Yeah. And thank you for sharing her with us, Frances. So it was a great read and a great conversation with you. So thank you. Thanks for joining us to celebrate moms today. If you want to get started writing your own book of life stories or want to give the gift of Storyworth to a loved one, head over to storyworth.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a really fun story. In the meantime, if you want one of your stories to be considered for the podcast, head to storyworth.com/podcast. Storyworth is a production of Evergreen Podcasts, hosted by me, Krista Baum, and produced by Aaron Land. Our sound engineer is Nate Corson, and we get production help from Wendy Sabroso. Thanks, everybody. And to my mom, happy Mother's Day. I love you. And to Sherry in Cleveland, Aaron wishes you a happy Mother's Day too. And we'll see you next time.